Hi, I'm Michael Reddy. I'm here to illustrate a family constellation for you using a wonderful new web-based tool. The constellation is one I call Terrible Migraines Fade. It's from my book, Health, Happiness, and Family Constellations. I'll be modeling and explaining it in CoachingSpaces.com. This is a web-based three-dimensional screen share environment for constellations and coaching. I'll use the 3D avatars in CoachingSpaces to illustrate how a classic group workshop-based family constellation would unfold. But more advanced forms of private one-on-one constellations can be carried out remotely via CoachingSpaces, with both client and facilitator able to see and manipulate the figures. Allowing for control of size, orientation, posture, and more, CoachingSpaces is also a very powerful teaching tool. I think you'll see that here. So imagine now 22-year-old Don sits down next to me in the workshop circle. He suffers from severe migraines. They're seemingly incurable. They occur primarily in autumn, but otherwise somewhat infrequently. He wants to do a constellation because they're threatening his job now. I learned quickly his childhood and immediate family seem warm and supportive, trauma-free it appears. Dad's maybe a little lost. What he knows about his father's family is that the parents, Don's grandparents, were not close as he experienced them. And they also lost a 4-year-old child, Don's father's older brother, Don's uncle, who fell through a wobbly stair railing, hit his head, and never regained consciousness. Intractable head pain connects obviously with death by concussion. This suggests Don's migraines may be anchored by this past event. If the tragic loss of a young child is not accepted and grieved, it often alienates couples and impacts later generation in the family system. To investigate this, I asked Don to choose and place representatives for himself, his dad, Grandma, Grandpa, and lost Uncle Ted in the circle. He places his grandmother first, his father second. Then he places a representative for himself. We notice Grandma is looking at the ground now. In a group workshop, the actual client, Don, would remain sitting in a chair next to me until the very end. His job in the beginning is to experience his family system from the outside. He places a representative for Grandpa. Grandpa is immediately stiff and disinterested. And finally, he places a rep for his lost Uncle Ted. In constellations, we lay the representatives for tragic or untimely deaths down on the floor normally. And we notice now in the picture that Dad and Don both look down as the uncle's placed on the floor. So here's the initial configuration. In CoachingSpaces, we can label the representatives. We can display their gaze lines. So this is a beautiful picture here. We can view from any angle or distance, and we can illuminate the primary visual field of any representative. So you'll see here in the right-hand picture, Don's primary visual field contains both Uncle Ted and Grandma. Notice they're standing in an arc around the lost uncle. However, Mom, Dad, and brother look away from him, and they look away from each other. The only one who looks at lost Uncle Ted is his nephew. So I ask each rep to speak briefly. I ask them, how is this for you? And I'm looking at their posture and their attitude. Dad's wobbly and confused. He says, I can't look behind me. Grandpa, stiff, adamant, I feel nothing. Grandma looks dejected, lost. She says, I feel sad, maybe some anger here. Lost Uncle Ted is not at peace. He feels left out, forgotten. Coming finally to Don's representative, he's simply stuck looking at Uncle Ted. So Grandma and Grandpa have their backs to each other, and neither look at their lost child. Querying Don, the actual client in the chair next to me, I learned some more things. Grandma blamed Grandpa for not fixing the wobbly stair rail, and then he blamed her for not watching little Ted carefully enough. Don also tells me that the accident happened in the fall, which is interestingly enough when the migraines come. So his grandparents' apparent bitterness, plus Don's representative's fixation on Uncle Ted, suggests that earlier unassimilated grief, anger, and failure to mourn are expressing now in Don's headaches. Constellations worldwide have shown that serious, unaccepted traumas can anchor analogous, change-resistant physical or emotional problems in the descendants of those who actually experienced them. But I want to test this anchor further now by allowing the representatives to move wherever feels most comfortable for them in the circle. So we'll watch where they go and notice what they feel. So Don's representative immediately goes down to his uncle and says, I experienced just tremendous grief and sadness here. His father, Dad, turns around, looks at his son, Don, down there, and just doesn't like seeing this. Grandma turns a little bit. Her oldest son, is now kind of in her peripheral vision. Her back is directly to Grandpa. She feels loss, and I think she feels alone in that loss. Grandpa, on the other hand, solid in his anger, still ignoring the whole thing. So a possible anchoring dynamic has been, more confirmed here. CoachingSpaces allows us to illustrate this and many other coaching and constellation concepts by creating objects and marking up the floor the figures stand on. So here I've tried to show that this constellation suggests that Don's subconscious, his social empathy system, which remains an expression of the family system, even though he's an individual as well, that this is carrying the unresolved grief, anger, and bitterness around this early death. No one else feels it, so the system shoves it to him, and he accepts it. Now, if this family system, with the help of the awareness and compassionate acceptance of the people in the workshop circle and the shared consciousness of the representatives, if it can process and assimilate this trauma, the ancestral anchor for the migraines can be removed. And this is really non-local atemporal work here, because it doesn't matter whether these people are present or already passed. If this happens, typically Don's headaches will either resolve spontaneously, or treatments that failed before will now become effective. Now sometimes the systems like this, once it's embodied in the subconscious awareness of the representatives, it'll just simply move on its own towards healing. So periods of silence are important. Other times, it's possible for me as facilitator to help by having the representative simply state the hidden reality. So let's say the system doesn't move on its own. In that case, I might begin with Grandpa, whose unbending anger seems to be holding everyone else in place. So I ask Grandpa to experiment. Can you just turn and simply look at your oldest son and oldest grandson? So he's willing to do that. He does it. After a couple of minutes, his face and posture seem to soften. You can see him in CoachingSpaces here. He's looking down now. When I see the softening, I ask him to express the current truth of the family system. And that is, he needs to say, I can't feel anything for you because I'm too angry at my wife. I give it a little more silence, a little more time, and his eyes start to tear up. And then, in a very important movement, he spontaneously speaks a new, different, and healthier truth. He says, it wasn't my fault, but I shouldn't have blamed her either. And once again, just let that resonate through the system. Hearing this, Grandma now turns and faces him. You can see, looking at them, even in these pictures, I think it's clear, a slow, silent reconciliation is taking place. Soon they stand close together. He says, I'm sorry, dear. And then a minute later she says, me too. I love you. With the bitterness between them dissolved, they turn and face their son and their grandson now. Dad, we notice now, looks up, turns, sees his parents reconciled once again. These are big movements. The feeling in the group becomes a bit lighter. And now in a spontaneous movement, another spontaneous movement, the representative for Don feels able to stand up and move back away from his lost uncle. This is a very typical healing movement. As ancestors and the grandparents in this case begin to mourn their son, to accept their own fate, to have their own feelings back, grandson Don, the descendant, is freed from feeling this in the family system. This is just how this stuff works. Grandma and Grandpa accept their grief, their mourning, and they're re-including their lost son now. Grandma says, "You are our lost son. We cherish you in life and in death." And after a minute, lost Uncle Ted on the floor, he says, "I can rest peacefully now." As the resolution progresses, I pull the representative for Don out and put Don himself in to experience this change. We do this often in constellations unless somehow there's so much unresolved trauma in the system, which there isn't here, that it might be too powerful for the client to stand in. Often we give healing sentences, expressions of the new alignment in the family in an attempt to focus the resolution. So I ask Don to say, "I'm little here. Your tragedy's too big for me. I give it back now." To reinforce the shift in the family system, I ask Grandpa also to speak a healing sentence. He says, "Thank you for carrying this, but it's our fate, not yours. Leave it now with us." Next, I ask Don to say one more important sentence, breaking the head injury link. I ask him to say, "Support me now, please, as I live headache-free, in honor of what you lost and what you went through in your life." We notice that Dad has now turned and is looking towards his son. So what's the aftermath here? What we're trying to do in a constellation is restore the flow of life and love through the root system, the earth-based root system of each individual person. So we illustrate that very nicely here with another CoachingSpaces diagram. What happened after this? We only know the constellations work or not work because we look at the results afterwards. In this example, the migraines are better immediately. They lessen immediately. Don's able to work the rest of the fall. And they depart as usual in January, but they don't ever come back again. The following autumn, they're just not there anymore. So this is a successful constellation. What's the perspective here? Well, there's two kinds of trauma. There's the personal stuff that's experienced by individuals, and then there's the stuff that's lodged in the family system because the individuals that experienced it never dealt with it. So family system trauma that has not caused additional serious personally experienced trauma often resolves in a single constellation like this one. More complex layers of family and personal trauma can require further constellations and other treatments as well to resolve. And I'll just add that increasingly evidence from epigenetics provides scientific support for the reality of generational trauma. Thank you very much for your attention, and I leave you here with another beautiful three-dimensional diagram from CoachingSpaces.com. Thanks.